Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Megan. Hello, viewers of Blogging Heads. I'm Jonathan Cohn. I'm a senior editor and blogger in temporary hiatus at the New Republic.
I'm Megan McArdle. I'm the business and economics editor of The Atlantic, where I blog and write business column.
And we are here to discuss a couple of things, but mostly healthcare reform. And this is very exciting. I'm both nervous and excited. You and I know this. Very few other people know this. We've had a version of this conversation, I think not once, but twice before. And the technological gods conspired against us to actually put it on Blogging Heads. But this time, this is different because it was some time ago. And back then, we had a hypothetical bill we were debating. Now we have a real healthcare reform bill to debate. It's passed. It's law, the Affordable Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. People who read me, read you, know where we're coming from, know I, broadly speaking, was a supporter of the law. It was not everything I would have wanted to be, but as far as my position was, I thought it would, broadly speaking, lead to better public health. It would make our healthcare system more rational gradually, hopefully meaning that we could spend our money more wisely and maybe not spend quite as much of it. And most important of all, it would, I thought, contribute to economic security for the country. Megan, I know that's not your position, so...
No, I think that it is definitely not going to contribute to economic security in the area of budget deficits, where I think the best you can say about it is that if you accept every claim that the advocates made as being completely correct, so accept the CBO score that said it would reduce the deficit, you still have the problem of basically we've got this gigantic Medicare entitlement that we know is going to bust the budget, and we just took the most obvious tax increases and spending cuts that you would have used to pay for making that more sustainable, and we used them to pay for something else. So the very best you can say is we didn't increase the budget deficit, but we made it a lot harder to close it. And I actually think it's much more likely to increase the budget deficit because I think a lot of the cuts and the taxes are not politically particularly sustainable, which is, you can sort of see because they keep getting pushed back. And I feel like if they were politically viable, they wouldn't have been shoved back all the way to the end of the budget window. I favored a much lesser intervention that I think has now basically been precluded by this bill. So broadly, no, I am not in favor of it. I'm skeptical that it's going to produce huge improvements in health, and I am pretty sure that it's going to produce a huge worsening of the U.S. fiscal picture.
Okay. Well, let me start responding. I mean, there's a lot in there, and maybe we can sort of spend the next 15, 20 minutes going through that list. Let's start though with the fiscal issues, and let's talk about these CBO projections for a second. I mean, that's sort of where you started. You said, even if you accept, I know you're skeptical of these CBO projections. Your argument is that these tax increases, these spending reductions aren't going to take place because, they're politically difficult. If they were real, they wouldn't be backloaded the way that they are. And let me just pause, make sure I understand. Do you think that about both the tax side and the sort of change spending reductions on Medicare, which are some of those, those do kick in earlier. Or do you consider those also politically unrealistic?
I think that there are two big spending. You get basically two big areas for spending cuts. The first is Medicare Advantage, which is an HMO program that Republicans, for a bunch of internal political reasons, made very generous. It's well liked by the people who belong to it. It gets about the same ratings as fee-for-service Medicare, which has caused a lot of people to say that, we can just cut it back to what we spend on fee-for-service Medicare with no political fallout, which I think is kind of like saying you drive a Prius and I drive a big honking Ford truck and we're both really happy with them, so if we switched, we'd be just as happy. I'm not sure. It's not clear to me that that's true. It is clear to me that senior citizens don't like having any benefits cut, and they're the most politically motivated and politically active demographic group in the country. So I think it's going to be very hard. The other side that I think is difficult is the producer price cuts. And I think that that's hard for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, there's also the fact that all of the producer price cuts, they lobbied. But the second issue is the way that it was done is a way that a lot of sort of, I don't want to say tricks because it implies something, but a lot of a lot of the ways that people try to close the budget deficit is by doing this thing where you slowly reduce the growth rate of something. And the reason that that is attractive is that the bite in any one year is supposed to be low. Unfortunately, healthcare costs don't really work that way. They often jump, and then they'll plateau, and then they'll jump again. And so what you get is that the price increases seem fine for a couple of years, and then suddenly you've got a hospital with an 8% budget shortfall. And when that happens, the hospitals usually scream. And so far, Congress has caved on the biggest example we have of this, which is the doctor price cuts, where you, in the 1997 Balanced Budget Act, we enacted this, what's called the sustainable growth rate for doctor reimbursements under Medicare. And this actually worked until 2002, because we had an abnormally low period of healthcare cost inflation. There are a lot of reasons that might be. People have debated it. I think the most plausible is people have said the HMO revolution worked, but then it proved really unpopular, and legislators and companies basically undid it. But when the jump happened, the doctors said, well, either you increase the reimbursement rates or we exit Medicare, and legislators jumped in and increased the reimbursement rates. And they've now done this every year, these temporary fixes, to the point where now, if they just did nothing, if they didn't enact a temporary fix this year, doctor reimbursement rates would fall by 21%. And that's clearly not. So the problem with the growth rate thing is that it compounds in both directions. Once you fixed it in one year, you then pretty much have to keep fixing it, because the cuts implied by not fixing it are so big. And so I think that these are all things that sound good, but the head of Medicare and Medicaid Services, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, has said it's not really clear that these cuts can be made without cutting service.
Right.
Maybe they can. But as you and I both know, probably the biggest single factor in healthcare costs is labor costs.
Right.
And labor costs are really hard to address.
Right.
People do not, we already have a nurses shortage. We already have a doctor shortage in a lot of key specialties.
Yeah, it's not nursing shortages and the reason, and the doctor issues, salaries get more into it. But right, go ahead.
Right. I think the nursing shortage is in a lot of ways more critical. But, you can't just cut RN salaries. They will go elsewhere.
Right.
They have other opportunities, as it were. And so I'm skeptical that after a few years of this, you're really going to get hospitals saying, yep, we can make a 1% cut every year, and we'll just hold down the growth rate. Maybe it'll happen. I'm not saying that that's not possible.
Sure.
I'm just saying you've got a powerful lobby and some actual cost forces that are arrayed against this. And I think what we're seeing in Massachusetts is, so far, the cost savings that were expected have, in large part, not materialized. You got a one-year fall in the cost of individual health insurance because they'd already had community rating and guaranteed issue, and so insurance prices were very high in Massachusetts, and they're still very high. But what you didn't get was this. What people expected was, for example, you would see your fall of the cost of caring for the uninsured fall so dramatically that you have huge savings you could use to cover other people. People are still using emergency rooms. The cost of caring for the uninsured is 60% of what it was before.
Right.
And so I'm skeptical. Not
right. And I appreciate that. You're skeptical and not you're allowing for the possibility it could happen. No, that makes sense. And let me say, we can come back to Massachusetts. I actually would paint a different picture of what's going on in Massachusetts, but I want to go back. I want to talk about this sort of broader issue of whether these cuts politically are realistic. And let me say that I can't. Just as you're skeptical but not sure, I'm optimistic but not sure. I can't promise these cuts will stick, obviously. We do have historical examples, though, when they have. The Balanced Budget Act, beyond the doctor fix, there were a bunch of other cuts in Medicare. They were quite steep, quite severe. If you look at the magnitude of what they cut, they were significantly larger, in fact, than the cuts that are now anticipated, that are now called for in the Affordable Care Act. And those stuck. Those happened. Those took place.
Some of them did.
Some of them did, but even if you account for what was taken back later on, the magnitude, Kaiser Foundation did a comparison and found that the magnitude of the cuts, even if you account for what was clawed back a few years later, were still larger relative to the size of the healthcare spending at the time than the cuts that are now anticipated. Now, I say that, and I say, we should have cut more. But, we didn't. But we did, the cuts that were made, I think, were reasonable. And I think this kind of also gets to the broader
So which cuts are we talking about specifically? Can you talk a little bit about that?
In terms of what cuts are, what I'm talking about in the
What
Affordable
cuts
Care
stuck?
Act? What cuts stuck? Well, I mean, they were across the board cuts in payments to hospitals, and they were felt. I mean, there's no question. If you went around, there was a lot of concern that those cuts were too deep. I mean, remember, this started because this all came out of the negotiations between the Republican Congress and the Clinton administration back in the late 90s that led to the Balanced Budget Act. And originally, the Republicans were calling for much steeper cuts to Medicare, and the Democrats wouldn't go along, and they kind of met in the middle, over the objection of a lot of Democrats, by the way, in the end. And if you remember, a lot of liberals were not very happy about these. But these were cuts to hospitals, and they were cuts across the board. What I would say is that, the reasons I'm optimistic that these will stick, in addition to that, is the fact that, those cuts were crude. And the doctor fix that you're talking about is a very crude cut. It's just an across-the-board cut. And it was basically imposed. I mean, this was sort of, they got together, they said we have to be, the budget's out of control, and we have to cut it. And so they did. The environment of these cuts is very different. And it speaks to why, I often hear people, why didn't we just cut the Medicare spending? Why did we have to do all this coverage expansion? Well, it was actually all part of one big piece. This was negotiated with the provider groups. They were asked to come to the table and say, look, what are you willing to live with and not raise a huge fuss about? Now, I didn't like that. I mean, if you ask me what don't I like about the Affordable Care Act, I think, we could have gone to deeper cuts to all of these different groups, the hospitals, the drug makers. You hear a lot about pharma. You don't hear a lot about the hospitals. Personally, I think that's probably who got off a little more easily. But, they were part of it, and they signed off. And the cuts that are imposed are not just across the board. Some of them are. I mean, there are some across-the-board provider adjustments, but there are also a lot of them.
But the biggest dollar amount comes, as far as I can tell, out of Medicare Advantage, which is across the board,
right,
and the changes and the indexing
right,
for the producer prices.
No, that is true. That is true. That is true.
There's a lot of little tiny things, but they're like, when you look at it, the line item $1 billion over 10 years, $3 billion over 10 years. Sure. Nothing in the context of this bill.
Sure. No, but keep in mind, I mean, the Medicare Advantage cuts, frankly, I mean, to me, I think those are the easiest ones of all to do. Medicare Advantage.
I guess we'll see.
I guess we'll see. No, I guess we'll see. That's right. But I mean, look, that this has happened once before in the late '90s. I mean, the original, the predecessor to the Medicare Advantage plan was Medicare Choice. This was back before, Medicare Advantage as we know it today. And for people who aren't following this is the private plans that offer alternative coverage to Medicare. Those plans grew out of the negotiations a few years ago with the Bush administration over the Medicare drug benefit. That was part of the package. But there was a private alternative to Medicare. This is for our viewers. I know, Megan, you know this. There was prior to that a system where you could opt out of traditional Medicare and into a private plan. It was called Medicare Choice. Now, when this started, and I think now, I could be wrong, but I think this also grew out of the Balanced Budget Act, although maybe it was before that.
I think it was actually prior, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking it's prior to now. So it existed sometime in the 90s, and then there was a predecessor to that too. The Medicare Choice Plan in late 90s, as they were going through, what are we going to do to get the budget deficits down, and what can we do to reduce spending? There were a lot of studies similar to what we've seen recently, where they said, what. The premise of this program was that these private plans can produce the same benefits more efficiently. The GAO, CBO, everyone looking at this says they're not, that we're paying them too much money for what they're providing, so we should pull that back. Now, they squealed, they screamed. The money did get pulled back. Now, you're absolutely right when you say that it wasn't as if that wasn't felt. I mean, Medicare Advantage plans pulled out of a lot of places, and you can read about it, and there were some unhappy people about that. I'm sure there will be some unhappy people when Medicare Advantage plans in the next few years, some of the insurers will decide this is not worth it to them because they're not making as much money, and they will pull out, and that will, there will be some unhappy people about that without a question. I think overall Medicare is better off for it, and that's a separate argument, but, I think that will stick. And
I guess I would say two things to that.
Yeah.
The first is that, as far as I know, Medicare Choice didn't have anywhere near as many beneficiaries. You've now got over 25% of Medicare patients who are in Medicare Advantage. Mm-hmm. And second of all, the way that the Medicare Advantage reimbursement formula now works, again, as you know, but our viewers may not, is that anything that's over the sort of actuarial set of, set for the region, they have to give back either, in any excess premiums, they have to give back either as more benefits, or they have to give the money back to to Medicare or the beneficiaries. And so, in fact, people in Medicare Advantage get more benefits than people in normal Medicare. I think they may notice that when that gets cut. And I think when you look at something like, I guess the question is it Medicare Choice or is it cat care? Because if it's cat care, then the Medicare Advantage cuts are going to get undone.
Right, and just for viewers, you mean catastrophic care? You're talking about the 1980?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
The 1988 act in which, hilariously, a mob of angry old ladies chased Congressman Dan Rostenkowski out of a town hall meeting and started beating him with their canes.
Right, we'll find a link onto the YouTube when they put blogging ads up so people can. It's quite a scene.
Yes.
It's very funny.
Well, there's a great like, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but there's a great quote from him where he asked his flack when this was going to clear the news cycle, and the flack looked at him and he was like, "You see that clip? They're going to play that clip when you die," which is almost certainly true. If he is still alive and hopefully has many good years left in him.
Right.
But the fact was, the actual expense was really minor.
Yeah.
It was a very small amount, and the expensive part affected 3% of seniors. Right. This was the extra tax that affluent seniors had to pay. I think it was between 3 and 4% of seniors were affected by this. Well, if a group of 3 to 4% of seniors can get that much motivation, especially when you look now at the political climate with the Tea Party's already out there, there's a lot of infrastructure to piggyback on.
Oh, sure.
And get this. I make no comment about whether we should or should not have Medicare Advantage. It's just I think that seniors, it's awful hard to take stuff away from them.
Right. Well, I would go ahead.
No, that's basically it. I think it's really hard to take stuff away from them. I think that the current program is going to be harder to repeal because it has a broader base, and because it isn't a case of like overpayments to providers at this point. It really is a case that they've been forced to funnel that extra money into benefits.
Okay. So let me. I got 4 things. I'll do them quickly because I don't want to get stuck on this. But let me make 4. The first is that actually there's a lot of analysis just that most of that money isn't going into benefits. That there are some extra benefits, but dollar for dollar. You look at the amount extra they're getting. It's not like, and there have been some studies on this. It's not. It's more like, and there's dispute over them. But we're talking a fraction of that money actually comes back out as added benefits. And remember that as part of this deal, right? We're also improving the Medicare package. So you have seniors who are going to have extra money in the donut hole, and eventually the donut hole will close. And they're also getting, and this is one of the things that happens right away, free preventative care. You don't pay for your checkup, no co-payments on, and that's not true now with Medicare. So that I think will mitigate it. Also keep in mind, this is now the status quo. We had that fight. Believe me, this came up, right? I know I did radio shows and TV shows where I said people are going to cut our Medicare Advantage, and we would argue back and forth, and they're going to people lose benefits. And we said, well, you're right. And there was the law was changed a bit to soften the formula, and I think most people looking at this think there will be some exit of Medicare Advantage plans. Of course, that happens today too. These plans go in and out all the time, but not a catastrophic one, not a huge withdrawal. But we had that fight. So, and this gets to kind of the meta point here, which is that the law is now that money is being taken away. If somebody wants to restore that money next year, right? If someone wants to say, all right, we can't do that, well, they're going to have to pay for it. And my proof of that is look at what's happening. Let's go back to the doctor fix. The SGR, this adjustment to the doctors. It's enforced today because there were lots of people, liberal Democrats I know, who thought, we'll just pass along, we'll just pass this, pass along this extra, we'll waive this cut in fees to physicians, and we won't pay for it because we haven't always paid for it in the past, and that'll be that. And lo and behold, moderates, fiscal conservatives in the Congress, in the Democratic Party, said, no, we can't do that. We have to pay for it. And as a result, it hasn't passed yet. Still sitting there today. In fact, today, as of today, I think today's the first day because Congress is back in session now, they are debating what to do about it. Now, at some point, I think they probably will push it back again, but they're going to have to find some offsetting money. And as we go forward, that's the thing, we've set, this is all you can do is to set the baseline. And, say that, look, if future generations want to run up a higher deficit by incurring new expenses or repealing old cuts and not paying for them, there's not really anything we can do about that. One of the reasons you mentioned that, in 2002 that they stopped paying for it. Well, I seem to recall the fiscal atmosphere of that time was we were cutting taxes, we didn't care about deficits, we were worried the government had too much surplus. If that's going to be the attitude in 10 years, we're going to run up new deficits regardless of what programs are in place. And I would say that that's true. Whether all we've done now, in effect, is said that, well, part of the scenery there is that we're promising to provide people with health care up to this level, and 10 years from now, if we have a group of people who are not fiscally responsible, and they could be Republicans, they could be Democrats, and decide in the year 2019, let's say, that, hey, you know what, we don't care about the deficit, we're happy to run it up. Well, okay, I can't stop them.
I don't think that's quite fair, though. I mean, in part, first of all, because when you're spending $200 billion extra, it's harder to control the deficit. It just is. There's less in the way of tax revenues and spending cuts, right? That is, you have made it harder for future generations to control the deficit. Even if it's deficit neutral, it just is. There's less money around for other stuff now, which is just inherently making it difficult. The other thing is, I think especially with Democrats, they've been incredibly disingenuous, right? On the one hand, they're complaining that Bush's tax cuts, they have to do them because it's so politically difficult. And then on the other hand, they're saying, well, we're going to make it so that our successors have to do X, Y, and Z, but that's not our fault. And I think, it's
Wait, I'm sorry. I don't see the.
They want to give right. Right now, the Democrats are planning to extend the Bush tax cuts for people under $250,000,
which I would not do, by the way. But go on. Yeah.
Right, but I'm not saying you are being disingenuous.
Right. No, I know. I just wanted to get. I know you weren't saying that. I just wanted to get myself on the record. So go on.
But on the one hand, they're saying, well, it's understandable. Obama has to do this because it's so politically difficult to raise them. But then on the other hand, they say, well, it's not our responsibility if 10 years from now, this program has put our future people in a position where it's really difficult to cut the deficit.
Well, I
don't
think that's true because it's true that the Democrats are saying it's politically difficult as a matter of tax policy, right? As a matter of voting on those tax cuts. You're right, and they're saying, look, we can't repeal them. We'll be accused of raising taxes. That's fine. On the other hand, that decision, that decision to let those tax cuts stay in place has constrained them in other ways. Because, there is money they don't have to spend, and they want to spend it. And this is sort of what I think would, on a kind of meta level, sort of bothers me about this discussion so much, is that, I think people don't realize, the ideal plan, my ideal, right, I'm a single-payer guy, so if I had done a healthcare plan, it would look totally different. But whatever, if we were in this model with the exchanges and letting employers sponsor insurance, my ideal plan, the people who sort of, I know the intellectuals, the wonks, the liberals in Congress, who, and maybe even the administration, who sort of saw this as the ideal way to do it. When you cost out how to really do it, if you wanted to get everybody covered as fast as possible and really give them the kind of insurance, and I know we would disagree about this, that I would consider ideal, that was a program that cost around twice as much, well, maybe not quite, but, at least $1.5, $1.72 trillion over 10 years, over the first 10 years. And that's not what we got. We got something about half that cost. And that was because the Democrats said, look, we're gonna pay for this, and we're gonna put down the markers for how to pay for this. And I say, is it perfect? No, and we can talk about everybody plays some gimmick or some budget. I don't call them budget gimmicks, but there were some things in there you can say, well, who knows if that'll work out, but. At the end of the day, if you're a fiscal conservative, I think you have to sort of tip your hat to them and say, you know what, these guys, they did it, and they were serious about it, and they did put the cuts, and they passed them. They're on the law, but they're on the books now. And, and two other things, this gets back to what I was going to say originally when I got sidetracked. There is this argument here, and you may not believe, this may not be the argument you're making, I've heard it from other people, but you often hear this argument, look, why did we, make these cuts, find these spending reductions, right? So take the money out of Medicare Advantage, do all the provider changes, both the big indexing stuff like you were talking about, but also the little stuff on Medicare to save that money and, change the tax treatment of health insurance, which doesn't actually generate a lot of money in the first years, but does in the second years, and tax the rich on their investment income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do all of that, but don't expand coverage, because that's the problem. You're now adding to the federal. You're adding to the federal entitlement burden. You're adding spending, and why should we use that money that we're now saving? Why should that go into this coverage expansion? And I wanted to. And it seems to me that what I think people fail to realize again is that you couldn't have done one without the other. If we're going to be in the universe of the politically realistic, And we don't have to be. We could have a discussion, what we would each do idealistically, and they both look very different than what happened in Washington. But in the universe of the politically realistic, you were not going to get those cuts if you didn't also expand health insurance coverage. And I'll give you one simple example, and there are others, but the hospitals are a perfect example. I mean, there's a huge amount of money is coming out, as you noted, in payments to the hospitals. There is no way on God's earth the hospitals would have sat by and let those cuts go into the law. And even if you think that they're going to get clawed back somewhat later on, I mean, they believe these are real cuts, that they are going to be facing them, because they faced cuts like that before. There is no way on earth you would have gotten them to go along with this if you didn't also promise them that, we're going to significantly reduce your charity care burden, because we're going to be sharply reducing the number of uninsured. And by the way, that's not just, selfishness on their part. I mean, the truth is there are a lot of hospitals, not all of them, that really do struggle to pay for charity care. And frankly, to kind of go to the hospital sector and say you're going to have to eat a cut of $200 billion over the next 10 years, flat out, they would have screamed it, and they would have had a right to protest that you had to expand coverage to make that viable. And the same is true for the pharma and whatever. And again, I think they could have borne sharper cuts, but this idea that we could have just cut the money, had the game changers, and not expanded coverage, I think is just completely unrealistic politically.
Well, I think that that's true now. But here's the thing. In the next 20 years, we're going to do one of two things. We're going to close the budget deficit and fix the Medicare problem, or we're going to have a fiscal crisis.
Right.
And in the context of that fiscal crisis, if we arrive at it with this program, it is harder to make the cuts, because we took the cuts we would have made then, and we spent them on something else. And as you say, there is status quo bias, and it is going to be difficult to cut this program either. So, from my perspective, in some ways, you have to save political capital. You have to save tax capital. This is why we shouldn't enact a VAT now. Because if we need that revenue, as I think we're going to, we should put it off as long as possible, because if we enact it now, we will spend it. That spending will develop constituencies, and that spending will be very hard to cut in the future. And so this is part of it. I agree with you. We could not have enacted them today. But if we were in a situation where a treasury auction was about to fail and the Fed had said, I'm not buying any more debt to keep the auctions from failing, then we could have made those cuts. But now we can't, because that money's been spent on something else. Well, and so we're going to have to make different cuts that are going to be deeper and harder to make. Well,
I guess I would say three things. First of all, obviously there's more to this equation, right? I mean, if the choice was to do this now and make it somewhat harder to make cuts in the future, and I'm not stipulating that, but just if that were the choice, do I take that trade-off? I'd have to add in the fact that I'm combating a lot of human misery for the next 10, 20 years, and that's worth something to me. Well, I know we disagree about how much human misery and what kind, but whatever. I also would disagree that this makes those cuts hard in the future. I mean, the sort of nature of health spending, as we know, again, and this is how I see it, this is the promoters of this bill have sold it this way. I think they are right. Is that the nature of our problem in Medicare, as much as anything else, is that healthcare spending is out of control. What this bill does, it doesn't radically change, that won't radically change the medical system in the next 5 years, the next 7 years, the next 10 years. I wish it did. What it does do is it puts in place a whole bunch of institutions and mechanisms to make those kinds of changes down the road. I think it will be easier to cut Medicare spending 10, 20 years from now, and do it in a way, by the way, that results in less spending but not worse care, because of the changes being made today, but changes that you couldn't get through. An example, again, to use another example, let's look at comparative effectiveness research. The pharmaceutical industry hates this. Hates. They do not like the idea, and we can have a separate argument whether it's good or bad, but they don't like the idea of people kind of the government running studies and saying, look, this new pill may be better than a placebo, but it's not better than the pill that's out there already. So we should only prescribe it to people in very special circumstances. And pharmaceutical companies, if you just did that as a straight up, wouldn't do it. And if you waited 20 years or 10 years until the Treasury auction you're talking about, we'd be in much worse shape, because it takes time to develop that information. We can't do a lot of that now because we don't have the information. However, in the context of this big bill, where we were adding prescription drug coverage for people, and they knew they'd have, in effect, a larger stream of business, and in the context of this giant bill where everybody is putting some money in, pharmaceutical companies said, okay, we won't fight that. In fact, we'll actually support this bill. So I feel like that is easier down the road. And the last point I make is that, when we look at the size of the health, you're talking about the added burden of this bill. You look at the size of the healthcare economy and the amount of spending, and we're just talking spending. I mean, I think it's paid for, but it is new spending to cover the uninsured, to subsidize coverage for people who struggle to pay for it now, to improve the quality of coverage. It is not that much money. It is around 2% of total healthcare spending. I don't think that bump in the long run is going to make it that much harder to solve the problem.
I don't think that number is correct. The new spending it's $200 billion. That's 2% would imply, what, 10 trillion?
2%, maybe it's 4%. I forget what it is. It's not that much. It's a relatively small percentage. And I should have thought the numbers before I said that. But
it's large in the context of the budget, though.
Oh, it is large in the context. No, it is large. No, it's large in the context of the budget. You're right. No, that's
$200 billion a year is a lot. It's about half what we spend on Social Security.
No, that's true. I wouldn't die. But one more thing. I want to talk about CBO for a second because this was something you brought up, and I didn't want to let this point hang. There's a lot of such. Look, CBO by law, right, has to sort of take at face value what it's given. So if Congress says it's going to pass a tax and the tax won't be enacted for 10 years, it has to assume that 10 years that tax really will be enacted. Or if there's going to be a cut to providers, it has to assume the cut will really stand and it won't be repealed. Fair enough. You could say you would argue that gives the benefit to the doubt to the architects of the law. I would agree. I don't think the benefit is nearly as big as you do, but let's agree on that. The flip side of that is that the CBO in all kinds of other ways is quite pessimistic. We talk about all these, the gurus on this, right? Talk about all these great ways to save money through the medical care system, everything from comparative effectiveness to IT, coordination of care, better pay for performance, all of that. And CBO basically said, we don't believe any of it. Or rather, to be more accurate, they didn't say we don't believe any of it. They said we can't prove any of it. And if we can't prove it, we're not going to count it. That is that I think gives the benefit of the doubt in the opposite direction. And also keep in mind, and this came up in the in the reconciliation. If you remember, the final part of the bill had to go through reconciliation. They had to show that it would reduce the deficit. And CBO, just for that piece, and it's only part of it, but for that piece of the puzzle, it was very interesting. Normally, you know how these projections work. When they run a model on these spending things, they throw out a whole range, right? Here's the higher end, the upper bound, lower bound, and you take the midpoint. What they said was, under the reconciliation rules, they had to certify, in effect, that the bill would not inflate the deficit. And they felt like that imposed a different burden. They had to certify that the lower bound, that the worst case scenario, would not inflate the deficit. So I look at that. I look at their extreme skepticism on all these game changers, and I feel like, CBO actually, in some ways, maybe they were kind of giving the benefit of the doubt to the architects of the law, but in a lot of ways, quite the opposite. It was they got, I don't know what the opposite of the benefit of the doubt is. They got they got the doubt, and I think you can make a case that those offset each other.
Well, let me push back a little bit a couple ways. I mean, first of all, you did have the head of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services expressing his skepticism that these cuts could be made.
Right.
Which I think should count for something.
Yeah, I agree.
And second of all, though, I mean, I think comparative effectiveness research, I'm in favor of it. I'm happy to have the FDA or someone else doing it. But I think that people have way oversold the benefits in a couple of ways. First of all, as we learned from the mammogram recommendations, right? I mean, mammograms are terrible. They're painful. They're not particularly dignified. You shouldn't have any more radiation shot through your body than you can possibly avoid.
And we're learning more and more about that. You're absolutely right.
Right. Women should have been thrilled to learn that they weren't supposed to get mammograms until they were 50. Instead, they freaked out. And so one problem is that, at least with high-profile recommendations, you're going to have a lot of political pushback, and I don't think that any agency is going to withstand that political pushback. It doesn't even in Britain, where the institution is much stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, so I think that is, I don't know how big a problem it is, but I think it is definitely a problem. But second of all, I think people tend to overweight how much you can tell from meta-studies. Medical studies are just really hard to do. They require so many people, especially for the kinds of studies that you want to do, right? To find out whether one statin is 10% better than another, you need an enormous number of people in the clinical trials. And so the bigger a treatment area, the more expensive the drug is, the more, first of all, political pushback you're going to get.
Yes, sorry about that, Internet. We were interrupted by a brief computer glitch. But I'll pick up to say that, like, as far as I'm concerned, that it's actually good to have these unbundlings of services because you don't have to pay for stuff you don't use, right? I used to hate airline food. I would never eat it. I would always bring my own food on. And now I don't have to pay for it. I don't have to pay for a horrible meal. Now, maybe it's only saving me $3, but, like, I could buy a pack of gum with that. And similarly with checking bags, I mean, first of all, it reduces the number of bags that people are going to check, and second of all, it reduces the weight of the plane, makes the plane flight cheaper for everyone else, and it means that I don't have to pay for the weight of the 97 pounds of books that you decided to pack and check. Right. I think that's actually quite fair, but people perceive it as being grotesque.
Absolutely. No, I'm very much in favor of cross-subsidization in health insurance, right? The sort of healthy subsidizing the sick. I'm very much not in favor of cross-subsidization of light packers to heavy packers. So I agree with you completely. I'm not an expert at the airline industry. I'm simply a traveler. My wife is actually a bona fide expert on the airline industry. She's actually a professor who does engineering and works and studies with the airline industry. And so, and she has made the point, and I'm going to get in trouble if I misstate this, so this is partly my interpretation, but, people don't realize how much they benefit from air travel, how convenient how much ticket prices have actually come down. In fact, that having to pay extra for these things is part of the way that as you say, that tickets have come down because they're not including these other costs in them now. And the internet has sort of driven us to this point where price competition for air travel is very intense. And and I love the fact that this this actually is very similar to healthcare. In that people will complain about the quality of their air travel. Oh, I didn't have any leg room. There was a delay, and they charged me for my bags, and they charged me for the food, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I can promise you, if there was an airline out there that was promising, fewer delays and better food and all that stuff, and charging the extra $100 per ticket that it would take, they'd go out of business. Because at the end of the day,
actually, there are airlines that do that. But they're a specialty, and they charge a lot more per ticket than
exactly right. No, that's right. Right. I mean, you can rent your own jet, and you can get all of those things, or these specialty airlines, like you said. But for the mass flying public, people can say that's what they want. At the end of the day, we're all going to go on Travelocity or Expedia, or we're going to see who's we're going to look at the prices, and most of us are going to pay that cheap price. So. I'm happy to pay extra for my bags, and if they want to charge me for a carry-on, fine. I mean, I actually tend to pack pretty heavy. My family makes fun of me for it, and they should, and I should have to pay extra for that. So I have no problem with that. And wow, we actually ended on two notes of consensus.
Yeah. I actually have to say, as a tall person, especially, the fact that in a lot of airlines you can now pay for extra legroom rather than having to arrive at the airport 3 hours early is a gigantic improvement in my life quality.
There you go. An unsolicited testimonial. Anyway, well, good. This has been fun. I'm glad we finally got this to work.
Yes.
And we'll check in.
With only minor technological interventions from the technology
gods.
So
we'll have this discussion again in 2020 to see how our predictions worked out.
We'll be wrinklier, but hopefully if you're right, in better health.
There you go. Okay, well, talk to you soon.
Farewell,
Thanks,
Internet.
Blogging Heads audience.